So today I'd like to talk a little bit about the notion of hospitality in Christian ethics. And what got me thinking about this was this wonderful book from my colleague Julia Claessens and Bruce Birch. Bruce is from Wesley Seminary in Washington, D.C., and Julie is a colleague here, professor of Old Testament at Stellenbosch University. And they put together this wonderful volume called The Old Testament Ethics and Human Dignity, Restorative Readings. The foreword, by the way, is written by Walter Brueggemann. So it really is an excellent book with a number of wonderful contributions. Now, I had the privilege of writing one of the responses to this book as an ethicist. And because the book deals with the notion of the Old Testament ethics and human dignity, I took as my sort of framing concept the notion of encounter with the other. And there were two particular others that I thought would be helpful for one to encounter when you're doing ethics using the biblical text. The first is the notion of hospitality with the text itself. Now, let's quickly talk about this notion of hospitality. The notion of hospitality, I think, is a very, very important one. Because if you think about it, hospitality requires some measure of grace. It requires a measure of openness, a desire or a willingness to be accommodating in some sense, to have your own boundaries shifted, perhaps even to be a little bit uncomfortable. And I think that's quite a helpful way to engage the biblical text. I think sometimes I see people coming to the biblical text with preconceived ideas. I remember a colleague joking once in the ministry saying, "Lord, I've got a sermon, won't you please send me a text?" And I'm not sure that's a very helpful way to use the Bible. Proof texting or eisegesis, pulling things out of the biblical text. Because you see, one of the problems with that particular approach to the biblical text is instead of allowing the biblical text to speak into us or through us or to shape us or mold us, we are merely looking for words and concepts that support what we already believe. By the way, that's one of the reasons why I think it's so helpful for pastors and particularly young theologians to preach the lectionary, to take the texts which are set in the Christian calendar and sit under the weight of those texts, to listen what it might be that they should share with their congregations. Now, in terms of ethics and hospitality in the biblical text, one of the things that we will know is that the biblical text has some rather challenging and complicated aspects to it. There are some parts of the text that some would find outdated or perhaps historically or socially problematic. For example, some of the issues related to gender concepts and the way in which women are treated in the Bible in particular, some issues related to sexuality and sexual identity, gender identity again. There may be some things related to economic models or, for example, human rights abuses, how people dealt with people, the ownership of slaves, etc. Now, in this book, Douglas Laurie wrote a wonderful, wonderful chapter about how, as Christians, we should deal with some of these problematic texts. And he said sometimes living with a problematic text can reflect something of our own brokenness, of our own sinfulness, of the way in which we present ourselves unknowingly in the world. And when we encounter something in the biblical text that we find problematic, rather than just glossing over it or dismissing it, spending a bit of time there can challenge us to focus on some of the aspects of our society, of some of the contemporary ethical issues that we may be struggling with. And so that notion of hospitality, of accommodating the whole of the biblical text, of living with it, not as a set of rules, not as 4 or 5 principles that you can pull out, but as a narrative that speaks of the character and nature of God and the complexity of this world and the religious identity that we have as Christians. That could be something very beneficial. Now, the second thing that I said in this particular chapter is that it's not only texts that speak to us, but people who read the texts. And this is a very interesting thing. This morning I spoke to my first year ethics class about the sources that Christians often use in their ethical decision making. And one of the most interesting things for me is often that people come to make decisions based on their understanding of the biblical text. And it surprises me how often people who read the same text arrive at different positions. Now, of course, that has to do with our gender, our view of the world, our social location, our class, education, our culture. All of these things influence the way in which we read the biblical text, what we see or don't see, where we place our emphases, and perhaps where we don't. And one of the things that I think is important for us in terms of Christian ethics is that often in the encounter with the other, as Emmanuel Levinas would say, we find that that encounter stretches how we think about the world. For example, I encourage my students very much to sit with a person who has a different gender to them, or maybe someone who holds a different theological position to them, and to listen to how it is that they may understand or interpret a particular biblical text, or deal with a particular ethical issue using the biblical narrative. How is it that they can resolve a particular challenge that they have ethically by sitting with someone who may hold a different point of view? You see, it's in that encounter with the other, through conversation, through learning to see that we may not hold all of the truth, but that the truth, which is larger than us, may in fact hold us and hold others together, that we can move towards a more just society. That we can recognize that God speaks the biblical text into the lives of people, and through our encounter with them, through encountering their difference, sometimes we can learn things that are helpful for us. So my encouragement to you today is to say, please don't treat the biblical text lightly, particularly when it comes to issues of ethical concern. Let's not use it to proof text. If you're looking for words to support your position, rather use a dictionary than the Bible. Let's allow Scripture to be taken seriously. Let's read it carefully. Let's read it often. Let's study it in its context, understanding what has happened behind the text, the social, historical context and setting, and how the particular language was used. Let's go deeply into the text. What is the narrative, the genre, for what was it intended? And then let's be very careful to build that bridge in front of the text to understand how it is that we can relate what was happening in this particular biblical narrative to what we face in our world today. So remember, today is not a lecture, it's just a thought. I'll share in the show notes one or two things I've written. Firstly, this chapter from Restorative Readings, the book that Julie and Bruce put together, in which I wrote, but also one or two pieces. I wrote a section in a textbook, an ethics textbook called What is a Good Life? And in this textbook, I wrote a chapter on the Bible and Christian ethics, and particularly related to the issue of homosexuality and people with the same-sex orientation, how we can deal with those particular texts responsibly so that we don't abuse people and that we don't pin things on God which God may not want. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you differ or if you think about it differently, I want this to be a hospitable space where we can work things out together, where we can engage one another if we disagree, or if you hold a slightly different opinion, or if you can state something more clearly and help me to grow in that. I'd love to hear from you. So please, can I invite you, if you found this particular video useful, by all means press the like button, please subscribe to the channel, and share it with others if you think that there's something that can be held there. So thanks for watching, and I hope that it may challenge you or invite you to use the biblical text in a responsible, rigorous manner, so that out of it we can understand what it means to live a good life that honors God, that blesses God's creation, people, and the created order, and that helps us to live a more just, humane, and dignified life. So thanks for watching.